Hello, and thanks for joining us in our study as we continue our study in the book of Jeremiah. We are looking at lesson 25 in the workbook series that was written by John Humphreys, dealing with the writing of Jeremiah. And in this lesson, we're going to be looking at the judgments that God renders about other nations, the nation of Moab, and Ammon, and Edom, and Syria, the Arabian tribes, the Edomites. God is wanting it understood that truly He is in control and is determining what is happening to all of these nations. I'm reminded of a passage that Paul gives us in Romans chapter 13 and in verse 1, where he says, "Let every soul be subject unto the higher powers, for there is no power but of God. The powers that be are ordained of God." God sees the affairs of all nations, not just our own. He sees the iniquity of all people and passes judgment as to what should happen to them. This is the section in Jeremiah where God is giving information to the prophet about what was going to happen to the other sinful nations of the region, and how that their destruction by the Babylonians was not going to be a chance happening, but rather it was God's judgment being poured out against them because of their iniquity. Over in question number 1 of this series, we find here in lesson 25 in question 1, he says, "What was the origin of Moab, and how were the Moabites related to Israel?" Well, if we go back in the Old Testament and refresh our memory about the things that happened with the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, we remember that Lot, Abraham's nephew, and his daughters fled from the city of Sodom before it was destroyed of God. But they were hiding in a cave, and while they were there, the girls were concerned that they would have no children because everyone would remember their association with the destroyed city and how that they were the sole survivors. And so as we go back over to the book of Genesis, we find in about chapter 14 the things that happened as Abraham there had rescued Lot from the invading armies that had taken over Sodom. There's several things said about the connection between Abraham and his nephew Lot. And then in Genesis chapter 19, and going down to about verse 37, it says that while they were hiding in this cave, this is the plot that the girls came up with. It said they made their father drink wine that night also, and the younger arose and lay with him, and he perceived not that she lay down, nor when she arose. Thus were both the daughters of Lot with child by their father. And the firstborn bare a son, and called his name Moab, the same as the father of the Moabites unto this day. And the younger, she also bare a son, and his name was Benammi, the same is called the father of the children of Ammon unto this day. So Moab was the son of Lot, and the incestuous relationship that he had with his oldest daughter. In question 2, it said, "Who is the god of Moab, and what will happen to that god?" Excuse me. In Jeremiah chapter 48, and going down to verse 7, it says, "For because thou hast trusted in thy works and thy treasures, thou shalt also be taken from Chemosh, shall go forth into captivity with his priests and his princes together." So Chemosh was the god of the Moabites, and he was going to be destroyed. Here again, it's God's punishment upon a sinful nation that was distantly related to the Israelites, but a nation that was turned completely to idolatry. In question 3, how complete will the desolation of Moab be? Well, let's look at verses 8 and 9. It says of the 48th chapter, "The spoiler shall come upon every city, and no city shall escape. The valley also shall perish, and the plain shall be destroyed, as the Lord hath spoken. Give wings unto Moab, that it may flee and get away, for the cities thereof shall be desolate, without any to dwell therein." So there was going to be a total destruction of the nation of Moab because of their iniquity. And God was making it very plain that this was going to be the cause of their destruction, and why it was things were going to fall apart for them. In verse 42 here of the 48th chapter of Jeremiah, it says, "And Moab shall be destroyed from being a people, because he hath magnified himself against the Lord." So here we find Moab's sin. They had trusted in their own works and in their false god. They trusted in their own strength and in their own abilities instead of giving credit to the God of all blessings. In the 48th chapter, in verse 7, it says, "For because thou hast trusted in thy works and in thy treasures, thou shalt also be taken." So we see why Moab has been doomed by God because of its iniquity. In question 5, what will happen in the latter days? Now, as we have noticed here throughout these passages, God's talking about the destruction of these nations, and he is also, in some situations, given a glimmer of hope that one day there would be a restoration. But that restoration was never historically documented as the resurrection of a country with a king. It is the spiritual resurrection of people having the opportunity to return to God as a result of the Messiah that one day will come. Here in Jeremiah 48 and going down to verse 47, God promises, "Yet will I bring again the captivity of Moab in the latter days, saith the Lord. Thus far the judgment of Moab." So there was going to be a perpetual captivity of this nation. As far as governmental affairs were concerned, they were not going to rise to preeminence ever again. But in the latter days, those days after Jesus walked the earth, there was going to be the opportunity of these people to draw back to God through reconciliation to God through Jesus Christ. In question 6, what was the origin of Ammon, and how were the Ammonites related to Israel? Well, we notice the same thing there in the 19th chapter in verse 38, where Ammon is the son of Lot and his youngest daughter. Once again, we are looking at nations that surround the geographic area where Judea and Israel existed. They were more to the east, over around the Dead Sea and moving eastward from there. They had been perpetual adversaries of the Israelites, and because of their iniquity, God chose to see them destroyed. In question 7, it says, "Who was the God of Ammon?" Well, if we go down to chapter 49 here in Jeremiah, and in verse 1, "Concerning the Ammonites, thus saith the Lord, Hath Israel no sons? Hath he no heir? Why then doth their king inherit Gad, and his people dwell in his cities?" Going to verse 3, "Howl, O Heshbon, for Arias is spoiled. Cry, ye daughters of Reba. Gird you with sackcloth and lament, and run to and fro by the hedges, for their king shall go into captivity, and his priests and his princes together." Whenever we look at the history of the nation of Ammon, we could go over to 1 Kings chapter 11 and verse 7, and we find that Molech was the god that they worshiped. Molech was a god that was popular among the Ammonites and others of this region. And unfortunately, they even did human sacrifices to Molech, this god. Over in 1 Kings, the 11th chapter, and going down to about verse 7, reference is made to this god and the vicious things that were done in service unto him. Here it's talking about how Solomon had married a princess from among the Ammonites and built even a temple to worship in. And it says, "Then did Solomon build a high place for Chemosh, the abomination of Moab, in the hill that is before Jerusalem, and for Molech, the abomination of the children of Ammon." So Molech is the god of the Ammonites, and once again we see another nation that would not fear God. In question 8, what is the possible meaning of Israel shall take possession of his inheritance? The point was being made that one day after the Ammonites had been destroyed, that Israel would be able to dominate the region, which they did. If we look at further history on down the road, we find that this nation was not going to ever rise to preeminence again. They would be a perpetual thorn as long as they existed, but Israel would dominate them, especially in later times whenever we see some things surrounding even that period of time between the Old Testament and the New. In question 9, in what did Ammon trust? Well, according to chapter 49 here in verse 4, it says, "Wherefore gloriest thou in the valley, thy flowing valley, O backsliding daughter, thus trusted in her treasures, saying, Who shall come unto me?" So Ammon trusted in the riches that they had accumulated as they had taken loot and plunder from other nations and had also been blessed in their own way. But now that was not going to buy them an escape from the domination of the Babylonians. In question 10, what will happen afterward? In chapter 49 and going to verse 6, it says, "And afterward I will bring again the captivity of the children of Ammon, saith the Lord." In other words, they were going to be looking at a perpetual captivity. They were never going to rise to preeminence again. They would be the footstool of many nations over the passing of time. In question 11, what was the origin of Edom, and how were the Edomites related to Israel? Well, if we go back in the book of Genesis once again and start looking at what happened in the succeeding generations following the birth of Isaac, and then you have Jacob and Esau as sons that were born. Well, Esau was going to be the father of the nation of Edom. And Edom, they would be cousins to the Israelites, but there would always be animosities between them. We find that Esau had sold his birthright to his brother in Genesis chapter 25 and going down to verse 30. Esau said to Jacob, "Feed me, I pray thee, with the same red pottage, for I am faint." Therefore was his name called Edom. And we find there that they wound up being cousins to the Israelites. But Esau is looked at as being a profane man. The scriptures tell us in another place, they were not religiously inclined, they did not want to serve God, and they, like the other nations, had been caught up in their idolatry. In question 12, it says, what is the only glimmer of hope for the people of Edom? In the 49th chapter in verse 11, it says, "Leave thy fatherless children, I will preserve them alive, and let thy widows trust in me." There is a glimmer of hope that some of the Edomites would survive, not to become a great nation again, but that one day they, as well as all the remnant that live in that region, will have a chance to come into contact with the gospel of Christ and through that be reconciled to God. That's the glimmer of hope that is given for them. But as far as a nationhood with a king and power and dominance and terrain, all of that was about to disappear for them. In question 13, how complete will the destruction of Edom be? Well, if we go down to verse 13 of the 49th chapter, God says, "For I have sworn by myself, saith the Lord, that Bozrah shall become a desolation, a reproach, a waste, and a curse, and all the cities thereof shall be perpetual wastes." And in verse 18, "As in the overthrow of Sodom and Gomorrah, and the neighbor cities thereof, saith the Lord, no man shall abide there, neither shall a son of man dwell in it." So Edom is also doomed for total destruction because of their iniquity. In question 14, the author asks, as the Babylonian army surrounds Kedar, what will be the people's helpless cry? Going down to verse 29 of this 49th chapter, it says, "Their tents and their flocks shall they take away. They shall take to themselves their curtains and all their vessels and their camels, and they shall cry unto them, fear is on every side." In other words, as the Babylonians come through and plunder this region, there was not going to be anything left for them. Fear was going to be on every side. as the Babylonian domination was going to be complete and total. In question 15, what will be the conditions of Hazor after the attack by the Babylonians? Well, if we go down to verse 33, continuing in the 49th chapter, it says, "And Hazor shall be a dwelling for dragons and a desolate forever. There shall no man abide there, nor any son of man dwell in it." So Hazor was going to be destroyed by the Babylonians, and it was also going to be a total destruction, not a dwelling for anyone. In question 16, what figure of judgment does Jeremiah use against the Edomites? Well, he talks about them as a nation being scattered to the four winds, going down to verse 36 of the 49th chapter. "And upon Elam will I bring the four winds from the four quarters of heaven, and will scatter them toward all those winds, and there shall be no nation whither the outcasts of Elam shall not come." So here we find them being totally desolate. The domination by the Babylonians was going to be total, and there was just not going to be anything left. In question 17, where will the Lord set his throne of judgment, and what will be the result? Well, in verse 38, he says, "I will set my throne in Elam, and will destroy from thence the kings and the princes, saith the Lord." So God would use Elam as a bit of a stepping stone for the destruction for all of this surrounding area, as God's judgment is poured out upon these nations. And then in question 18, it says, what will happen to Edom in the latter days? Well, in verse 39, it says, "But it shall come to pass in the latter days that I will bring again the captivity of Elam with the Lord." So once again, Edom and Elam, all these nations round about, are going to be destroyed utterly. The only hope that exists for them is that one day a Messiah would come and the message of the gospel might reach some of the residents left in these areas. But as far as there being some resurrection of these countries, Edom coming back to power, Moab coming back to power, all of them were doomed to a perpetual captivity because of their iniquity and the judgments of the Lord against them. So this section in Jeremiah is just outlining the domination that God was going to allow the Babylonians to exercise over this region. It was going to be God's judgment and punishment upon these wicked nations for the way in which they would not serve him. But in our next lesson, we're also going to notice that Babylon itself is not going to escape God's judgment. Whenever they turn to their ways of iniquity and cease to fear God or serve him, then God will bring destruction upon them as well. But all of this is being given to show that it's not just a happen so in world events, but rather God was behind all of these things, and that these nations had no hope. There was nothing for them to cling to say somehow we're going to escape and somehow we are going to survive. But rather God is saying through the mouth of Jeremiah, this captivity is coming upon you, and it's going to be indeed a great desolation. Well, we hope that you'll join us next time as we continue our study in the book of Jeremiah, moving on in then to lesson 26. Thank you so much for studying with us tonight.